But within church planting, not all planters are the same. They're not all the stereotypical alpha fitted jeans, coffee drinking hipster guy. Some of those are exceptional leaders, but that's not everyone.
It's interesting, when I asked that question we asked at the start, should you plant a church, could you plant a church? Often the reason for saying no is because they don't see themselves as that type of leader you've just described there. And so there is that alpha male kind of picture in there. Some people are like that, and that's great. And there are particular church planting models that suit people like that. But there are a whole range of church planting models out there that we need different kinds of leaders for. Well, welcome to the second episode of the Planting Australia podcast. This episode we're looking at, should I plant a church? Should I plant a church? Should you plant a church? I'm Derek Hanna.
I'm Madeline Galea. Derek, I've heard you say that if you can plant a church, you should plant a church. That's a bit bold, just my opinion. Is this true?
In a nutshell, a bit bold, Maddie. Yeah, look, it is a bit of an exaggeration, but I do want to say, as always, when I put that to students, often at colleges or people who are thinking about it, people I'm talking to, it's designed to be a provocative question. There's always caveats to it, but I am convinced that people need Jesus. I'm convinced that church plants reach new people, and I'm convinced as well that more people could plant a church than are willing to admit. And so what that question does is it pushes people to ask the question of themselves, why not me? Why not me? That's what it's there for.
And so there are a few reasons why you shouldn't plant, and that's what we're going to explore now. And so the first one is character.
Character, as we will often say in Geneva Push and Reach Australia circles, character is king in ministry, not just in planting, but in ministry in general. If you don't have godly, biblical character, nothing else matters in this. Even more important than helping potential planters think through whether they're gifted for planting, whether they've got the wiring for planting, is helping them explore whether they have the biblical characteristics of Christian leaders. Personal virtues, behaviours, they affect everything in your leadership. Patience, kindness, humility, faithfulness, self-awareness. These are the things that really matter when you lead people, because everything else that you do will bleed out of those things. They're shaped by them. If you're a gifted leader, people will follow you. They will follow you. And we have history littered with people who are charismatic, gifted leaders who led people down very, very unhealthy paths. In the church, outside the church. But if your character is deeply flawed, you'll damage them. And if you're leading a church, you'll damage the church and you'll damage the cause of the gospel. So competencies can be taught. Competencies can be taught, but character is much harder and much slower to build. So as we talk to potential planters and planting couples, the first thing we want to say to them is character is king. Character is king. We must begin with that.
Okay, character is king, reason number one. What is reason number two?
All right, second thing is this, church planting is not a more important calling than others. So we don't want to lift it up to say this is the pinnacle of Christian ministry. Christ is the head of the body, and each part, Romans 12, plays its part within that. Some who head towards full-time ministry will be kids workers, some will be youth workers, some will specialise in an area within church, some will be great 2ICs, some will lead existing churches. For each of those roles, it does require different giftings of people. Different types of people will do those things. And the same is true of church planters. While there are certainly overlaps with skills required in other areas and for other roles, church planters do have a specific set of skills we'll talk about in just a moment around vision casting, gathering people, some of those things. But we want to make sure that we say with church planting, you don't want to go into it just because you think it's sexy or there's something glorifying about it or because you think it's the pinnacle of ministry. Church planting is not a high calling, but it does require a particular set of giftings that we need to explore. But just that, don't go in because you think it's the pinnacle of Christian ministry. Now, that's two, character is king, and church planting does require gifts, but it's not the highest calling. But as we've been talking this through as well, there's another thing that you're seeing in assessments particularly that is absolutely key. What's that one?
Yeah, so if you are married and you're considering church planting, if your wife isn't on board, if she doesn't want to do it, If she doesn't like the potential ambiguity of church planting, then we would say don't do it. Your first ministry is always to your wife and to your children, so she needs to be 100% on board. It doesn't mean that, you know, there's some anxiety around planting. It's a big thing. There is high risk, but if she has serious reservations, we would really discourage you, and that's something we really push into in the assessment process. She doesn't have to be a full-time kids worker, nothing like that, but she has to be just as committed to, we are church planting together and we are in this together. Yep.
And the challenge is the guys are often thinking a long way ahead with this, just because they're in a different space, or either Bible college or the heads are in this. And so the assessment process, we're trying to bring the two minds together, because you're a team when you plan. And so how do you do it together? And if you're not at that point together, then we would say, hold off, wait.
Yeah, and you could, if you're thinking maybe in 5-10 years, maybe I will church plant, bring your wife in on the conversation now. Give her time to adjust to the idea, to get used to it, to see how she feels about it. You'll do her a lot of good. It'll probably do yourself a lot of good. So keep talking about it.
Absolutely.
So there are some reasons not to church plant, but within church planting, not all planters are the same. They're not all the stereotypical alpha fitted jeans, coffee drinking hipster guy. Some of those are exceptional leaders, but that's not everyone.
Yes.
And there are different models of planting.
Yeah. And it's interesting, when I asked that question we asked at the start, asked guys in college, should you plant a church? Could you plant a church? Often the reason for saying no is because they don't see themselves as that type of leader you've just described there. And so there is that alpha male kind of picture in there. As you mentioned as well, not all planters are like that. And what we need to keep putting forward to people is, some people are like that, and that's great. And there are particular church planting models that suit people like that. But there are a whole range of church planting models out there that we need different kinds of leaders for. And so people need to be able to see the possibilities for who they are in these church planting models. In some church planting models, that parachute pioneer does require a particular alpha male personality, or the entrepreneur who gets things going from the ground up. But in the mother-daughter church planting models, or in a multi-site church planting models, it takes a different kind of leader, because the size of the launch team is different. So a church planter in these models will require different leadership skills. In the multi-site organisation, mobilisation, the parachute, more entrepreneurial. But often we rule ourselves out of church planting. I see lots of people do this very early on, because they have one particular model, they don't fit it, and so it's all off the table. And we want to say, no, not all church planters are the same. Not all church planters are the same. Lots of different models. And so you need to explore those models, explore your context before you say no to church planting.
And as we help guys identify, or where are my giftings lie, what kind of model would suit me best, we've built a tool called the Church Planter Assessment Tool, the CPAT, and it does exactly that. So we ask a series of questions based around core competencies for all gospel workers, but then we ask additional questions related to different models of church planting, which kind of helps you think through, okay, this is how I'm wired, this is where my strengths lie. Is there a particular model that could suit me best given how I'm wired?
Our hope is that you're finding the Church Planting Australia podcast helpful and challenging, and spurring you to think about how you could reach Australia through church planting. You can download all these resources and more in video form, on podcast apps, or on an ebook by going to genevapush.com/planting Australia.
But given that, that's a tool that we have, but there are common characteristics that you would want across all planters. What are they?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the CPAT that you mentioned has a spine running out, a foundation running underneath it, which is biblical characteristics. So if you do it, you'll see those. That's section one. The second part of it is pushing into competencies for different models. But across all those competencies for models, there are some things which we are looking for and pushing people towards if they're thinking about planting in any of those. Now, here they are. There's four of them. First, church planters are evangelistically driven. They're optimistic about that. There is a missional heart to them. They often have a kind of holy discontent that the overwhelming majority of the population in Australia don't know Jesus. They're frustrated often with the existing structures or the existing church, that they're not reaching people in that. And they have a passion to do something about it. They are confident that God works through the gospel. They've seen that God can work. And as flawed as they may be, they think that he can work through them. And you've seen this as well with church planners, haven't you? You've actually been part, there's one other church you've been part of, not in Australia, where the people leading it are exactly like that.
Yeah, so Auckland EV, Rowan and Sarah Hilsden left Sydney to start it in Auckland, and it really came from a desire that there's plenty of lost people in Australia as well as New Zealand. They quite loved Australia, and while New Zealand is a beautiful country, it meant leaving home, leaving friends, leaving the place they grew up in, but it was solely a desire to reach the lost. And that was the reason why they uprooted their whole life, their family, 3 kids, and had 1 on the way, and yeah, moved to New Zealand.
Not, they didn't have it on the way to New
Sorry,
Zealand.
no,
That would be an interesting fly, wouldn't it?
Yeah, pregnant.
Yeah, I understand how it works. Okay,
that would be difficult. No.
All right, the second thing, so evangelistically urgent and optimistic, that's the first one. The second one is this. Church planners need to have a track record of implementing, of executing things, not just coming up with great ideas, of executing stuff. So if you can point to things in your life that you have started, whether inside or outside of church, that's a good indicator that you might thrive in a church planning environment, that this might be something for you. If you haven't started something, not all is lost, then just start something. And that's what we're saying to young people thinking about planning. Start something and see how it goes. It'll give you a good idea of whether you're wired to deal with the ambiguity and the challenges, the stress of starting something new. Now, there's a guy, Liam Doyle, who planned up in Lake Mac, which is north of Sydney. Epitomises this for me. He is just a guy who starts stuff just naturally, just oozes out of him. So he ran a coffee bean business. He was bivocational when he planted. He's a guy who is very good at not just coming up with ideas. Anyone can come up with ideas. He's a guy who executes them and sees them through. And we've seen that skill translate not only from his coffee business, but other things he started, and to his church plant. So Liam Doyle. Yeah,
so not just his ministry, but I mean, it sounds like he just does it everywhere, in his life.
He does. And not everyone needs to be the Liam Doyle scale, but there's something about that we want to see and look for. Here's the third thing. Church planners are good at gathering people and casting vision. Now, you might have heard it said that you know you're a leader if you turn around and people are following you. That's, seems like the very definition of leader. But church planners are wired like that. While they might often have more ideas than are possible to implement, one of the things they do is they do dream big, they do cast vision, and they do gather people around that vision and help people see how this big vision out there can become a reality down here. And they want people to join them. They're not lone wolves. They're not just out there. They're gathering people. And look, Andrew Hurd, I think, is a great example of that. Both in his plant, in the church plant he's got at EV on the Central Coast, but also in his vision for a whole number of other things. FIC, I think you see it being implemented there. The Geneva Push Network, that he was one of the founding members of, and as well Reach Australia, which in the last couple of years. So he is not a guy who just has big ideas. He gathers people and brings them along with him. You want to see that in church planners.
He is a good example.
He's a very good example.
Yes. And what's the fourth one?
The fourth one is church planners. You mentioned this before, and we've mentioned the context of husbands, wives. Church planners need to have a relatively high threshold for ambiguity and uncertainty. There is nothing certain about church planning. Even in the lower risk models like multi-site, there is still a high level of risk, much higher than an established church, because there's nothing to fall back on. There's no systems, there's no structures that have existed for 100 years that will just keep turning. You need to keep things going. And in the early days of a church plant, you're juggling a whole number of things. You're juggling relationships, systems you're trying to set up, people you're trying to network with, new evangelistic context, trying to put it all into place and little to fall back on. So church planters need to be able to deal with a high level of ambiguity and uncertainty and adjust quickly to different circumstances and have the resilience to be able to deal with things when they don't go according to plan and when they fail. Now, these challenges can provide challenges for anyone in leadership, but just as a church planter, you're dealing with a much higher level of uncertainty and a much higher level of risk.
Well, if you'd like to continue exploring this topic, we'd really encourage you to do the CPAT, the Church Planner Assessment Tool. You can do this by going to genevapush.com/CPAT, and here it will help you work through and identify which church planning model might suit you best. And once you've completed it, we will be in touch. Well, that's it for this episode, but please join us for episode 3 on thinking through how do I decide where to plant at genevapush.com/planting Australia. For gospel competencies for all workers. Oh, that doesn't make any sense, does it? No, it doesn't.
Go again!